gosh. I forgot about that.
I was thinking about that when we went down the stairs.
Oh, because that was here.
Yeah, kind of a couple of small things.
Okay, Bob loves me now. It's okay.
Bob's cool. I like Bob.
Didn't scar me.
Well, that and a different one. Yeah.
No one was scarred by
It's
the
kind of like taking me a while, but it doesn't have a due date on it either, so.
It's just funny because we were talking about something that was related to that, like in class, like that week about being aware that people have disabilities or something.
No one told me.
Interpretation of like substantially all assets.
I'm just making fun of my silly moment at the legal checkup we had here.
What was that?
Hey, I'm James.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Laura. I think I've emailed you several times.
Laura Burke, okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Shreya Pendleton. I have a bit of a cold, so
Okay.
I don't want to spread that to you.
Yeah, I'm Jennifer.
Jennifer, okay.
Hey,
Oh, Rob,
good to
good to
see
see you.
Yeah.
And Robbie, you must be on one.
Yeah.
We're gonna have all of our summer folks.
I'm sorry. Oh, hey, good to see you. I'm sorry I'm getting here so late. I've been sort of running around crazy. It took me 40 minutes to get here.
Oh my goodness.
It's awful. So what do? I sit down here?
Sit down here.
Down there with
I thought of this because, you know, this is only like our third one, and I did the first one, so I didn't really have to think about an introduction. But if you can do that to begin with, I'm gonna type it up for the next person.
Okay.
That'd be awesome.
All right.
It's pretty basic.
All right. Okay. All right. What time we start? 10?
Yeah?
All right, we'll get some drink.
Yeah, we're good. I think he's nervous.
Minutes to get in yesterday, and then once I finally got in, I forgot my phone in the car and forgot like everything, and bad morning.
Oh, I didn't tell you that after the summit.
Easy.
You know how I took
Today,
Margo?
I left earlier today, and it was
Well,
much
between
better.
Lindbergh and my
you'll
apartment,
see
which
next
is
week.
what, 3 miles? It took me 2 hours to get home.
It'll get
No.
much better.
I'm
I
dead
passed
serious. It took
Sprague
me
High
2
School,
hours.
and it just
There
backs up
was
traffic so badly.
the
So
light.
much
and
Oh, that's one of the things
the
you're
light right in
learning
front of my
is
complex, which is like the
The
one,
times
the
the
second
school
one after
starts
this,
and where the schools
was
are and how to
before
avoid
it
them.
was out, so it was just
Yeah.
There's cars like turning off at
People
weird
flip
times,
out
like,
like
so
once they're
55
supposed to.
I mean, granted, it
so
was
I guess
like
that's it.
That's
2
where
forward
they're going.
lanes
They
and
found
turn
it
lane,
all
but like,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
kind of complicated.
That's the biggest issue
But,
that I have. Like in the
and
morning,
talk
I go to
about
my
Because
kids'
that
school.
happened,
How
like
can I
every
go where I
traffic light
don't
just like
have
off timing because
buses
we're blocking the
schools
intersection.
that I go by?
My mom called me.
So, or I go by
Hey,
them
what are you
when
doing? Like,
school's
Mom?
starting.
I've been in the car for an hour and a half and I live
So
3
we're
miles from here.
It looks great.
Explode.
What, the presentation? Yeah, I'm sorry, it was last minute. My wife's been on bed rest for
Oh, no.
her 26th day. She's pregnant.
Yeah, I figured when you said.
It's 26, she's in the hospital, so she's been in the
Oh,
hospital
no.
for the past, I mean, she's fine, it's just that it's like, I've just been running around, like, you know, 3
Now,
hours here,
do
3
you
hours
have
there.
any?
No.
It's, okay.
So I spend like 3 hours here, and then 3 hours there, and then 3 hours at home.
How far along is she?
33 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
So she's gonna be there for a couple
Oh
more
my
weeks.
goodness.
It's gonna
But
be.
everything's okay?
Yeah, he's gonna be early, I think, but, anyway. So, not that, I usually get things done better.
When you're crazy?
Yeah, when I'm not crazy.
Uh,
So who's the audience? I mean, how many people are gonna be on?
Do we know?
It's normally like 20 something, I guess.
But then it's put up on a website for anyone to view anytime.
Anytime.
Picture.
And
I don't want you to have fun here on it.
it's the disheveled, you know,
Yeah.
professional.
You need to look in the mirror.
I don't have a contact one.
Somebody, you have a mirror?
All right.
I'm
Is that okay?
girly.
No.
Good.
That's better, you
This is
got
my
it.
hairstyle.
It'll be good one of these. We're running around.
Yeah.
Want you to look good.
Well, so it's like people that are on bigger nonprofits or smaller ones,
The size that we normally represent, you know,
Okay.
so
like
2
startups.
million and
or-
below. No startups. We don't do startups. And in fact, you'll notice it says existing
Oh,
501c3s.
okay.
We save it on the website though. We usually have quite a few hits, and right now we're redoing our website so we can put all the webinars on our website also. So
Okay.
it'll be out there for a while.
Well, I saw an ad on the website for this thing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was these 2 other people from another law firm, Darcy.
Yes, that was a little error.
I haven't been able
But
to
on the
update the
web,
website.
yeah, we
Yeah.
make it into the website, but in the email where people actually sign up, your name is on there.
Right. Yeah, they're doing it next month
Okay.
in June,
All right,
and
that sounds
it
good.
just,
Well, I didn't know
our
how
web
to
guy just has a little bit of trouble.
All right, well, I didn't know I need to explain.
That's right, we're using a new person.
So, and so this is going to be a 30 to 45 minute speech, and then questions for like 30 minutes, if people have them. Is that what you want me to do?
Not 30. I mean, I don't think you'll have 30 minutes.
All in an hour? Is that what you want? All in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I didn't know if you had questions like you wanted us to ask you or.
No.
Okay.
No.
Now, we may have questions.
Now, I
really
thought I was
good.
going to have a chat, like a chat line or something. Who's going to ask
You-
those questions?
You will.
I'll ask the questions if they come through here.
And they see my face and the PowerPoint?
They see your face and they are able to download the PowerPoint, yes.
Okay. Oh, they download the PowerPoint. Okay. And then they have a little box where they see all the questions and stuff?
I don't know if they're able to see all of my replies, but they'll be able to hear yours.
Okay.
So he'll actually say the question to you and then you'll, it's fine. Anybody has phones? turn
We're not
them
live right now, are we?
Yes, we are.
Oh, we are?
Yes. No one's on.
Well, maybe you could put the cap over the lens. All right.
Everybody's silent, you're done.
I think it's still in my bag.
So she's doing okay?
Yeah, she's good. She's just,
Yeah, it's hard. I've had a lot of friends who were, I had friends that were on bed rest like for 20 weeks.
yeah, it's a long, I mean, it's awful, but, I mean, you know, whatever you gotta do.
Can she get up at all?
I mean, she goes to the restroom and showers every few days.
But they're keeping her at the hospital as opposed to at home?
She was in the hospital for a week, and then she got home for 10 days, and then last Monday, she went in, and they said, for an appointment, and they said, you gotta go downstairs and check in the hospital right now. So she, and that was the first appointment I had missed, and so she had to go down. I was actually over in Lake Oconee, so I came back, and then, she's been there ever since, but she's doing pretty good. She won't eat any of the food.
Well, at least she doesn't have another one.
Yeah, no, that would be,
Yes.
the dog is,
Bad
no.
enough. That does make it even harder.
But anyway, between that and then I've had a transaction that's actually, you know, been really hot trot or whatever, and so I was like, man, I had got to get this done, I got to get this done, I could get it done, and then finally all weekend I worked on it. So, anyway.
Well, next time call me and I can help you to get the slides or whatever.
Well, no, lawyers are notorious probably for getting stuff done last minute, and I don't like to be like that.
Yeah. Well, it looks good.
Thanks, hopefully it'll be okay.
It'll be fine. Can you tell us when you're ready? Or are we waiting for people to get out?
I have 6 users online right now. 8. 9. So they're coming in. And I'm actually ready when you guys are.
Okay. All right, well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the monthly webinar presented by the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. For those of you that don't already know, Pro Bono Partnership provides free legal services to small 501c3 organizations who serve the disadvantaged and disabled in Metro Atlanta. My name is James Stevens, and I will be talking today about good corporate governance for nonprofits. I am a partner in the corporate department here at Kilpatrick Stockton, and spend most of my time doing mergers and acquisitions and securities transactions and corporate governance work for for-profit corporations. But for the past several years have been spending a lot of time working also developing and forming and seeking tax-exempt status and then advising on an ongoing basis nonprofit corporations. My understanding is that everyone here is an existing nonprofit corporation, so we're not going to spend any time talking about the formation, but there's a couple of things I want to touch on about the sort of core fundamentals that are required for a nonprofit tax-exempt corporation, just to put the program in context. Obviously, a nonprofit corporation is a corporation formed under state law and subject to special statutes and the and the purpose of it is to be a corporation that's not operated for profit with shareholders, but a nonprofit corporation to the benefit of a public purpose. That public purpose is fleshed out a bit more in the Internal Revenue Code, which allows nonprofit corporations to seek tax-exempt status if they are operated and organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, public safety, literacy, or educational purposes, or for the prevention of cruelty to animals or children. Many of you may have organized the nonprofits that you're associated with now. If not, you are a director or an executive officer or some other staff person at a nonprofit, and you probably have heard for some time about corporate governance. Has been a hot topic in the for-profit arena. Throughout this decade, we've had a lot of disasters that have struck companies like Enron and WorldCom, and there's been a lot of discussion in my day-to-day world about corporate governance, and a lot of focus on it by government officials and shareholders and the media. More recently here, even in Georgia, we've had some focus on corporate governance as it relates to nonprofit corporations. And because of that, many of you probably are wondering if you're doing the right thing, and what are some of the repercussions if you're not. I'm going to talk for the most part about generally, not specific to Georgia state law. I operate in Georgia state law, but frankly, there's not a ton of lawsuits out there that are based on Georgia law. So the law is really some general principles that are applicable statewide, and most of the law that is applicable to nonprofits is taken from corporate law. And so we'll talk about it generally, and we can try to answer any Georgia-specific questions people may have, but I think that the principles we'll talk about today are going to be applicable to most nonprofits. First, let me give you a summary about what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll just do I've already done my general overview, and then we're going to talk for a few minutes about some of the basic corporate governance documents. Then we will go in and discuss the basic governance structure. We'll spend some time on board of directors. We'll spend a few minutes on officers and the executive director. We have a few other topics that I'm going to talk about. Some of them I've stolen from other presenters because they had already developed some good slides on it, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to have a few minutes at the end where we can answer any questions. I can answer any questions you have. So let's click through the overview here. Okay, so first let's talk about some of the basic corporate governance documents. All of you, if you're in existence, already have in place articles of incorporation. I've sort of referred to this as a corporate birth certificate. It's a general document, very short, that establishes the company under state law, sets out that it's a nonprofit corporation, and has a purpose that is articulated in that is essentially the touchstone for everything that the organization does. The only thing from a corporate governance standpoint, I would say, that we'll talk about later is that your articles of incorporation or organization, if they don't already, should provide for indemnification of your directors. The next document that everyone has or should have already are your bylaws. Your bylaws are not filed with the state, and instead are internal rules that you keep in your minute book, and you can update from time to time by a resolution of the board of directors. They talk about how the organization will function and how it should be governed. They have specific details about the composition and functioning of the board, meetings of the board. It sets out the officers of the corporation and what their duties are as delegated specifically or assigned specifically by the bylaws, and also provides in more detail the provisions related to indemnification that we'll discuss in a little while. Depending on your organization, and I would say most organizations should have some other documents that I would consider part of your basic corporate governance documents. a third one is the conflict of interest policy, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that is the policy that outlines how you're going to address and approve or deny transactions in which there is a conflict of interest involving a director and the organization's interest. Another items that we could have are committee charters. We'll spend a few minutes talking about committees of the board of directors, and if you have committees, if you want to establish them, you should always have a charter in place and should review that from time to time. A third thing that every organization should have is a basic code of ethics or a code of ethical conduct. And this one is the general rules that should govern any organization and will be outlined, and it's something that needs to be adopted at a corporate governance level that's applicable to directors, not something just for a staff or employee handbook. And that would be another document that you may have. The basic governance structure of a nonprofit corporation, and again, hopefully most of this is background, but I think it's helpful to talk about it, is you have a board of directors, officers, and your executive director, and then you have your staff. Directors in most nonprofit corporations are self-elected. The board elects themselves and can serve, depending on what the bylaws say and how the company wants to operate. Can serve for a year and be elected each year or serve longer terms. But that's the basic feature of the directors, is that they do self-elect. The directors hire and supervise officers and executive directors, which may or may not be employees, but are appointed and elected by the directors. The officers and directors, in turn, hire and supervise any staff or employees. Many nonprofits I work with have no employees, but if you start to get some size and you need more people on your staff, then those people will be brought on by the executive director and other officers. Let's spend well, I've got a couple of sort of high-level summaries about those three groups. The directors, I just point out that their function is essentially to direct the organization. They act as a group. Directors have no power individually. They only can act as a group. As I mentioned, they self-elect. I think the basic priority that you should keep in mind when it comes to the role of directors is that they are charged with making sure that the purpose that's articulated in the nonprofit corporation's articles and stated in the tax filing that you file to get your tax-exempt status is being pursued at all times. Directors can form committees, which we'll talk in more detail about, and those committees are formed to either perform a specific task that may end, or they are established and continue on to perform ongoing functions. As I mentioned, the officers carry out the responsibilities, are elected by the board, and they carry out the responsibilities either delegated by the board or hardwired in the bylaws of the organization. Then we have the staff, which we talked about. And then finally, let's talk for a second, we have potentially advisors and advisory boards. Many of you have people that are interested in your organization that maybe don't want to or can't commit to the responsibility and the time commitment of being a director. And so many organizations, as part of their corporate governance structure, may want to have advisors or an advisory board where you have people that have no day-to-day power or day-to-day responsibility, and in turn should have no liability with respect to decisions that are made. But we can still establish within the corporate governance structure a place for those people, and we normally would call that an advisory board or something like that. Okay, let's get into some more detailed discussion about the board of directors. Again, this is the group that is charged for the overall direction of the organization. Directors themselves individually have no power to do anything. They only act as a group. Your board should be people that are interested and committed to the organization and willing to commit to the responsibility and the time commitments associated with it. There's a movement in the for-profit sector and certainly in the nonprofit sector as well about to try to ensure that you have at least a majority and potentially all or all except for the executive director of your organization to be independent. In the nonprofit sector, independence is a lot less of an issue than it may be in a profit context, where you have potentially two for-profit organizations where they're customers or they have vendor relationships. You could have that in the nonprofit sector as well, but the idea is just to make sure that there's not people on the board that may, their decision-making process may be compromised by a lack of independent, mindset towards the organization. You can also put your employees or staff on your board, and many times your directors will elect the directors to be the officers of the organization, and I think that's a good thing to do. I would say that you want to avoid having, for example, a CFO on the board if you don't have the executive director. When you have people lower down in the organizational chain on the board than the people higher up, sometimes you have conflicts where the people that are perhaps lower down in the organization, forget the fact that they are, working for the executive director or another officer. So you want to be careful about that. But generally speaking, having your officers and other employees is a fine thing to do, depending on the facts and circumstances. At this point, you all have boards of directors, and they've had an organizational meeting at inception. And so now what the directors should do is make sure they have regular meetings and that you should have an attendance policy. This is a problem that I see with a lot of nonprofits, is that you have people that are excited and energized when you form an organization. They get on the board and you never see them again. That is never good, and to avoid the difficulties that are associated with removing people from boards once they get on it, or burning bridges with someone that may be a potential source of donations. It's good to have an attendance policy at the front end and require that your directors be there. In the SEC world, you have to report in your proxy statement if you don't have at least 75% board attendance by your board members. And so I would say, as a rule of thumb, if you have a large board of directors that has a lot of meetings, 75% attendance may be a good rule. If you have a small board that meets 4 times a year, missing one meeting is not going to be good. So I would say that you may require 100% attendance in that context. Any meetings that are held should be documented, and I've got a slide here on board minutes because I know that there's a lot of questions about that, and we have one here.
Should the attendance policy be in the bylaws, or should it just be a board policy?
No, I think that let's talk for a minute about the distinction between those two things, and that's really why I brought up articles and bylaws at the get-go. Articles are filed with the state, and you should file them, and you should think, I'm never going to change these. So you put just as little as the bare bones stuff you need to put in there, and you never look at it again, potentially. The bylaws should be more formal, and I think that that you should not. My recommendation would be to not put your attendance policy in your bylaws, because it may change, and you really want changes to the bylaws to be a big deal, even though it's not, everything, whether you adopt a policy or you amend your bylaws, it's all done by a vote of the board. There's really no difference in the approval. You don't want to have have a bunch of amendments cobbled into your bylaws, and you don't have to amend and restate them from time to time. And so I would recommend that you have in your bylaws just the number of directors, a basic meeting structure for regular meetings, and that you have a separate standalone policy that sets forth the attendance requirements and potentially establishes a meeting schedule, which would be thought of as special meetings in the, as described in the bylaws. Once you go to these board meetings, you want to make sure that you take minutes. And I know that a lot of people wring their hands about minutes and wonder exactly what all should be in there. I will point out that the Form 990 that we'll talk about a little bit later, which is the annual report you file with the IRS, asks you whether you keep your board minutes contemporaneously, and there's some guidance about what that means. I would just say that you should always, you should take minutes during your board meetings. You should type them up immediately thereafter and circulate them to your board as soon as you can. At a minimum, if you have a monthly meeting schedule for your board, then you should have them complete by the time of that next board meeting. But when you get to actually writing the board minutes, the idea is not to include a transcript. You know, it's not like a court reporter, like if you're doing a deposition, you know, which I don't do, but you know, other lawyers do. You know, they sit here and they write every word that happens, and a lot of times the first time you take minutes, you think that that's the purpose. That's not the intent. The intent is to have a high-level discussion that illustrates that the board discharged its fiduciary duties that we'll talk about in a few minutes, that is sufficiently clear that actions taken are approved, and that shows that the board deliberated on those actions. You don't want to have any individual directors pointed out, except for perhaps if a director makes a motion to approve something, you can put them in there. But you know, the board minutes should not read like a novel or a transcript like a deposition. It instead should just be a high-level summary of what happened and what was approved. If you have a presentation, if you have an outside, let's say you have employees and you have an executive compensation consultant come in, or you are going to have a big fundraising effort and you have an outside fundraising consultant come in, you should affix any presentations like that by outsiders to your board minutes, so that in the minutes of the organization it's documented what happened. You should also have resolutions if you know that there's going to be a specific action taken, and those should be prepared in advance of your meetings. For example, if your organization is going to borrow money, that you should have a resolution, which will probably be provided to you by your bank, that specifically authorizes the officers to sign the loan agreement, sign the security documents, you know, approve a UCC financing statement, provide information to the bank, and those resolutions should be, you know, a couple of pages and drafted and distributed to your board in advance of your meeting, read, discussed, and then passed as drafted, and then filed in the minutes of the organization. Also, many of you, and I would recommend that most nonprofits should do this, should have the authority in your bylaws to act by written consent of your board. Sometimes it's not feasible to have your board get together and act or meet, especially if you have directors that are spread out around, you know, geographically, or you have directors that travel a lot but still are participating in the functioning of the organization. Or if you have actions that arise that have some time sensitivity to them that can't be done at the next board meeting, you want to have the authority to have written consent. Any minutes or written consents by the board should always, together with the resolutions and the presentations, be put in a minute book. And just to spend a minute on a minute book, if you come to our firm and and you're a pro bono client or a for-profit client and you ask us to form a corporation, just as a matter of form, we spend $75 to buy, and well, you would spend $75 to buy, and we would buy it on your behalf, a minute book for the organization that would have the corporate name on the spine. It would have a seal in it. It would have tabs in it for various corporate governance documents, and it would be a clearinghouse for all these documents that we've talked about today. And they should all be put in there so that at any moment you know that everything that relates to the corporate governance documents is in one centralized location. Whether or not you come here or go to another law firm or hire or find one of those books on your own, at least get a 3-ring binder and put all this stuff in it. A minute book is just a critical piece of good corporate governance. Although it seems ministerial in nature, I can tell you that if somebody doesn't have a minute book, they don't probably have good corporate governance. I've got a couple of questions here, or a couple of things that should impact any director decision. The first is that any major action that's taken by the board of directors, that the board of directors should always be asking themselves, does this action advance the exempt purpose of the organization? Any action that is taken should be tied to this to make sure that the board and the organization is advancing that purpose and not the purpose of an individual or some other purpose that's not tied closely to that tax exempt purpose. The second question is that the board should ask, does the action benefit a private individual? The Internal Revenue Service prohibits a tax exempt organization from being used to benefit an individual. While you can pay reasonable benefits and compensation to employees, the primary benefit of any action should inure to the organization. If your board asks itself those two questions before it takes any action, you are probably going to be going down the right path. You know, are we doing this consistent with if you have a board that is acting pursuant to the fiduciary duties that we'll discuss next, and they ask themselves whether this benefits the purpose and whether this is inappropriately benefiting a private individual, you're probably not going to go wrong. Another thing that I would recommend that you consider as part of your corporate governance documents is whether it makes sense to have a mission statement. A lot of times you don't go back and you look at that purpose, or the purpose sort of evolves into being a little bit more fleshed out. And you know, so I don't want to. A mission statement, in my mind, has a bit of a connotation like a, it's not, sort of a waste of time or something potentially. But I really think that for boards, it's a good thing to sit down at least at a meeting and have a whole meeting where you just talk about what's the mission of this organization, given this purpose that we have, and given what we're trying to do here. Write out a few sentences. There's no art form. It can be a paragraph, a page, bullets. You have to use bullets, and write a mission statement and review it regularly and evolve it over time. And that mission statement, I think, will make sure that those two questions, whether what we're about to do furthers the purpose and whether it inappropriately benefits a private individual, is advanced in connection with board actions. So I would encourage that as another corporate governance document. As a final note, I missed it earlier, I'd say that because boards act as a group, and you need to make sure that you always have the appropriate quorum at your board meetings. You could really run into problems if you ignore that requirement that's going to be found in your bylaws that, for example, a majority of the board members have to be present. So this is sort of separate from the attendance policy, because hopefully they're all there at your meetings, but if they're not, you need to make sure that you have at least the minimum required to take a board action, because God forbid you don't, and there's something that happens and someone pursues legal action against that organization. If you didn't act with a quorum, then you couldn't have been acting as a board, and so you must have been acting as an individual, and so you're not going to have the benefit of the protections that we'll talk about next. So the responsibility, those two questions, what we've talked about thus far is really the responsibility of the board. Make sure you're furthering the purpose. Make sure you're not benefiting a private individual. And so the way that you do that is by discharging your fiduciary duties. The duties that I think that directors have are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty. Some people also graft on the nonprofits corporation a duty of obedience, and it's articulated, I've seen it articulated as a duty to obey applicable law, your corporate governance documents, and the purpose of your organization. Well, we just spent a few minutes talking about those same things, and I think that really that's the way I kind of look at this, and it doesn't really matter as long as you're doing all this stuff, how you organize it in your mind, but I sort of feel like it's your responsibility as a director to further the purpose, not benefit a private individual, obey the law in your corporate governance documents. And the way that you do that is by discharging those things in compliance with your duty of care and your duty of loyalty. But you can think about it as a third director's duty. So the fiduciary duties in a little bit more detail, duty of care and a duty of loyalty. The duty of care, and these are the same duties that are present in a for-profit organization, and the same things that there is, hundreds of years of case law that have been developed and are well articulated rules that govern the conduct of people that are fiduciaries for others. They're people that have a duty to discharge their obligations because they're acting for the benefit of someone else, someone other than themselves. The duty of care requires that directors act in a reasonable and informed manner, in good faith, and with the care that an ordinarily prudent person in a like situation would reasonably believe to be appropriate in similar circumstances. That's the duty of care. The duty of care, to do all of those things, to live up to that standard, it requires that you attend meetings. You can't be informed and exercise the care of an ordinarily prudent person in like circumstances if you're not at the meeting. You have to exercise independent judgment. That being said, you can't not deliberate and hear the thoughts of your other directors. I mean, the core of exercising your duty of care is to show up at the meeting, talk to your fellow board meetings about the action that you're going to take, and then to make a decision based upon that in your own independent judgment that's well informed by the people that may come in and do a presentation, by the officers and executive director that may come in and do a presentation to the board, and after hearing the thoughts and feelings of your other board members. You also must have adequate information. You can't show up at a board meeting with 500 pages of materials placed in front of you, expect to digest that information, and then make a decision based upon that information all at one meeting. Unless you're a speed reader, you have to get that information. And I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't know if you're a director or if you're presenting information to a director. If you're presenting information to a director, you got to get it to them in advance of the meeting and enough time for them to digest it. If you're a director, you have to insist that you get the information in advance of a meeting so that you have an opportunity to digest the information. And then the last thing is this concept of good faith, and there's really no definition. People debate what is good faith, and they always essentially say that good faith is the absence of bad faith. So you just got to have good intentions, and if you act with an informed manner, and you listen to your fellow board members and deliberate and make an independent judgment, and you have good intentions, then you're probably going to be compliant with your duty of care. The other side of that is your duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty is the duty to exercise your powers in the best interest of the organization. Rather than benefiting someone else, you have to be acting to the benefit of the organization. That means that you're going to avoid self-dealing, you're going to avoid conflicts of interest, or you're going to decide how to deal with conflicts of interest consistent with a policy that you've put into a policy statement that you're going to live by every time you deal with these decisions, and you're not going to usurp corporate opportunities. Self-dealing is obvious. It's acting in the interest of the organization and not in the interest of some other entity or person. It all goes back to that exempt purpose, and that notion that you're not acting to benefit a private individual. If you're a director, you can't make a decision that benefits you unless it's brought up and dealt with at the meeting and is only an ancillary benefit, and really it's what you're doing is nonetheless in the best interest of the organization. Conflicts are going to come up, and it's improper to make decisions when there's a conflict present without everyone being informed of that conflict and it being deliberated upon and being voted on in a way that shields that decision from being assailed later on for being a decision that was made when a conflict of interest was present. What I would suggest you do is that you have a corporate governance, as a corporate governance document, a conflict of interest policy that requires that all conflicts of interest that a director has be brought up before a decision is taken, be approved by directors that don't have an interest in that conflict, and that as a general matter, even if it's brought up and even if it's approved by disinterested directors, that it be fair. If you have directors that maybe can't get their heads around a decision that a director has an interest in and it's approved and it ends up being wholly unfair to the organization, and the directors, because they were provided inadequate information or they just couldn't, understand because they're not dealing with the day-to-day operation of the organization exactly how unfair a transaction may be, then you're not going to be shielded by having a disinterested director vote. You really need to make sure that you have a disinterested director vote and that the transaction is fair. Corporate opportunities are those things that a director should know that the organization might have an interest in. If the organization if its purpose is to serve a group or a neighborhood or a cause, and a director has his or her own corporation that has a contract where they are going to perform a function for pay for a group or a cause, and it turns out that that is something that the company, that the organization, the nonprofit organization could have or may have been interested in doing, and a director doesn't bring that to the organization before they seize that opportunity, they will have violated their duty of loyalty. It's not that an organization is going to do everything, and certainly with limited resources and limited dollars, they can't do everything, but they should always know if a director is about to do something that the company may have an interest in. They should know about it. The director should know about it in advance and have an opportunity to pass on it, essentially. In addition, I would say that, and this hopefully goes without saying, is that directors should always maintain the confidentiality of the organization. They need to, anything they hear or see or understand as a result of being involved with this organization should be maintained, should be held in the highest confidence of that director, and it should never be disclosed, I would say, ever. But as a general matter, unless it's something that becomes part of the public arena of information, only at that time should a director talk about it. But deliberations in the boardroom are something that should never see the light of day outside of board minutes. If you exercise the duty of care and the duty of loyalty, you have this wonderful construct that's developed in corporate law, and it's called the business judgment rule. And that is a general rule that says that a court, when looking at director decisions, will not second guess those decisions if they were made consistent with the duty of care and loyalty. It's sort of a recap of the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Those, I kind of said them fast, and really you can kind of break it down into a few elements, which I put on the slide here. And the principle of the business judgment rule is that a court will not re-examine with the benefit of hindsight and second guess decisions that board members have to make in the heat of the moment if the directors all act in a reasonable and informed manner. Again, attendance, information, in good faith, again, not having any bad intentions, with the care that an ordinarily prudent person believes to be appropriate in similar circumstances. This is not, you don't have to be, this is a sliding scale. I mean, each decision is going to have a heightened level of care that somebody has to take. But in these circumstances, you're expected to essentially not act with negligence. And if you act in the best interest of the organization, and that is essentially saying not in violation of the duty of loyalty, then you're going to be protected by the business judgment rule. I will say that the business judgment rule doesn't cure everything. If you act with willful misconduct, you're engaging in tortious conduct, which is, or if there's some other especially egregious situations, courts will not have any problem going around and looking at a decision and piercing through that. Well, not piercing, it's a bad term in this context, but looking past the business judgment rule. Okay, so now let's get back a little bit to kind of the functioning of the board, and just say that that sometimes boards may find that it's helpful to discharge these responsibilities with the help of some committees. And these committees can be formed to do a specific function, or they can be ongoing functions of the board. I'll just click through 4 typical committees. An executive committee, this is essentially a committee that's a subset of the board that can act in lieu of the board, has the power to act in lieu of the board when decisions need to be made and the board can be convened. This is probably only applicable if you have a really large corporation or a geographically dispersed organization, and in many cases isn't necessary if you have the power to act by written consent. Another committee is a corporate governance committee, and this is the committee that essentially thinks about these things that we've been talking about today. They want to, you know, on an ongoing basis, evaluate the board, look at its composition, look at whether the board needs some education on these functions that we were talking about. And they're also probably the ones that are going out and looking for new directors. Audit committee. This is the committee that is really should be made up of people that have financial and accounting expertise, and you know, depending on the complexity of the organization, it may be appropriate to have one of these to engage an auditor if you have one, and to make sure that the company is keeping good financial records. And finally, if you have employees, you may have a personnel committee, which would be charged with compensation decisions and evaluating job performance, certainly of the president or executive director, and maybe some of the other officers. Now, to get back a little bit as far as the, I guess I want to go to the liabilities that directors could face, and it sort of goes back to the fiduciary duties, but really we're kind of done with, the way I'm thinking about this is we've sort of finished the responsibilities of the directors, the way they may organize themselves into committees, and the duties that the directors have when they're performing those responsibilities. And now we sort of flip to, well, what is the potential exposure that directors have? And to summarize it, that directors can be held accountable for not discharging the responsibilities or for violating those fiduciary duties. It's weird to me in a nonprofit corporation, because when directors in a for-profit corporation don't discharge their obligation, the people that have standing to sue them based upon the violation of their duties or not doing their job are the shareholders. They are the owners of the organization. But in the nonprofit context, you know, who are those people that should have standing? The beneficiaries may be a cause or a community or a widely dispersed group of individuals that changes over time. So it's difficult to see how those people can and should have standing to sue and hold accountable directors. Alternatively, you have these donors that donate money, but really they donate money, they get a deduction. Their purpose is, they certainly have an interest in seeing that their money is going towards the purpose, but it's difficult to see how they could go in and sue and hold the directors accountable. So generally speaking, what the states have done is they give the power to the state attorney general to essentially, like many other things that the state attorney general does, represent the public interest. And these nonprofit corporations are established for a common good, and so the attorney generals are usually the body that are charged with holding directors accountable for not following these duties, for not discharging those responsibilities, or for diverging the funds that were given to this organization for improper purposes. And so with that in mind, with that potential exposure and those potential being held to account by some stakeholder, and typically the state attorney general, you ask, well, what can directors do? And I say that obviously the best thing they can do is to exercise their duty of care and duty of loyalty when discharging their obligation. And if they do that, they have the most powerful defense that's potentially available to them, and that's the business judgment rule. where they're not going to be second guessed for stupid decisions, only uninformed or decisions that are made outside of the duty of care and duty of loyalty. In addition, I would say that all nonprofit corporations should provide for indemnification. It should be in your articles of incorporation, organization, whatever it may be called. It should be in your bylaws. You may have a contract, but indemnification is giving that director a legal right to be made whole for damages they suffer or lawsuits they get brought into when they're acting in their capacity as a director. It's not going to cover them when they're acting inappropriately and they're acting outside of the duty of loyalty, for example, and they're taking action that benefits them and not the organization. The company is not going to have to indemnify that director. But in situations where they're discharging their obligations and when they do it appropriately, nonprofit corporations should say that the resources of the nonprofit corporation will be there to make those directors whole. Now, many of the nonprofit organizations that I'm associated with don't have a lot of resources. So what I would say is that you need to, if you can afford it and if you can find it, insurance is hard to get these days with all the scandals that have gone on, but I think for most nonprofits you should be able to find director and officer insurance. You should buy insurance that will essentially pay those directors directly when they have damages or when they get brought into lawsuits, or that will make the company whole when it has to make directors whole in connection with some of those indemnification provisions. That's essentially everything I can say about directors and their functions and their duties and the potential liability and ways that we as nonprofit organizations can protect them so that we can actually recruit directors to be on the board given those responsibilities and their potential exposure. Now let's talk for a few minutes about the next tier in the corporate governance structure, and that would be your corporate officers and your executive director. These people should be set forth, some of them, not all, in the bylaws, and it will say what their functions are. And they should be elected by the board and may in fact be board members to perform these functions. The president or executive director is the chief operating officer. They have inherent authority to enter contracts on behalf of the organization. They're charged with supervising and directing the management and operation of the organization. They are charged with managing anyone lower down in the organization's responsibilities and functions. While not necessarily as far as ranking may go, because you could have vice presidents and other people, you also need to have a corporate secretary. And that person should attend all meetings of your board of directors. They should be responsible for that minute book that we talked about. They're responsible for the minutes of the corporation. They're responsible for written consents and putting all that stuff together. They're not a secretary of the board in a ministerial, administrative assistant type capacity. They're a secretary in the sense that they are charged with documenting the corporate governance functioning of the organization as a whole, and you should always have one of those, a corporate secretary. The next one is your treasurer, and your treasurer is the one that is responsible ultimately for the corporate funds. They keep the records, and they, the treasury function can evolve, and as your corporation gets more complicated, you may have a chief financial officer who is over the treasurer, or they may be the same person as the treasurer. You may have a controller that does the accounting, and then you have a financial officer that sort of sets the financial policy, and the treasurer may be one of those people or someone totally different. But as an initial matter, every corporation needs someone that's on point to be responsible for your financial records and the record keeping from a financial standpoint. Those people are also the final say on disbursement of funds and your banking relationships. Next, I have a few corporate governance topics, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Essentially, I've got a bunch of detailed slides. We'll just kind of read through them quickly. and then we'll have a few minutes at the end where you can have some questions. First, I just want to mention the Form 990. That's the form that you make every year, file every year with the IRS, and it requires, and in recent years has required more extensive disclosure about your corporate governance structure, policies, and disclosure practices. Your directors and officers' roles and time commitments need to be disclosed. You need to disclose any contracts where your officers' directors are getting a personal benefit. You need to disclose any changes you make to those basic corporate governance documents. And I would say that a nonprofit corporation should consider, and I would recommend, that they have their directors review their Form 990 that is filed every year, just because it gives them a good sense as in a centralized location about what's going on in the organization in all manner, from corporate governance and financial standpoint, and ultimately can raise issues if there are any. Next thing I want to talk about briefly are financial controls, and this is a big topic when you're dealing with tax-exempt dollars. And I would just say that you need to ensure that your fundraising solicitations always meet applicable law. There's a lot of law around fundraising, and you need to make sure that you're aware of it and potentially advise and educate your directors on it, so that you can make sure that major fundraising campaigns and day-to-day fundraising is consistent with those obligations. The next thing you want to make sure is you have good internal accounting controls and procedures. When you've got people's tax-exempt dollars that you're dealing with, you want to make sure that you've got segregated accounts, you've got checks and balances on the use of and control of those funds and procedures in place. Next, you want to make sure you have a sensible and reasonable, given your organization, set of budgets and periodic financial reports. Boards need to see budgets and approve budgets. They need to have annual, at least, and potentially periodic, quarterly, monthly financial statements where they can see the coming and going and the overall financial condition, the coming and going of funds and the overall financial condition. Depending on your organization, and I've got a couple of bullets on specific law in Georgia, but you may need to have an auditor do an independent audit of your financial statements, or something less, which is called a review of your financial statements. And so I would say that either the board or an audit committee, if you have one, should be well versed in what those rules are and should consider whether you've got the right mechanism in place as far as your auditor and what that auditor is doing for you. Also, I would say that the directors, a core function is to make sure that you're using the assets of the organization in an appropriate way. If you're buying computers and desks and things, you need to make sure that those things are being used for the functioning of this organization, and that you understand what the assets of the company are and how they're being deployed. The next one is document retention and destruction. This is a hot topic ever since Sarbanes-Oxley came out, and it really put a fine point as a result of some of the ridiculousness that was going on at the turn of the century in connection with some of the big blow-ups in the for-profit sector about people destroying documents and hiding what was going on. And you should consider having a policy and procedures in place about disposing and archiving records that includes guidelines for handling electronic materials and deals with what you're going to do if there's an investigation that's underway and how you're going to control documents to make sure that they're not being destroyed and they're being appropriately segregated and retained. There could be criminal exposure for nonprofits even under this Sarbanes-Oxley Act with respect to document retention and destruction. And it's certainly a hot corporate governance topic. Another one is whistleblowing, and this one is also a fallout with the poor person at Enron that blew the whistle and got fired, and so he came out with Sarbanes-Oxley that puts some criminal some crimes around taking action to punish whistleblowers, and so nonprofits should consider whether they want to have a whistleblowing policy that deals with a way that employees or volunteers even potentially can bring complaints and possible wrongdoing to the attention of the executive director or to the attention of a board member or various board members, so that if something's going on, if funds are being used for private purposes, if people are using the nonprofit corporation's jet to fly on vacation, which may be totally hypothetical, then that those things are being brought to the board's attention. And also you want to make sure that that policy deals with documentation of how you deal with those whistleblowing things. And a final hot topic is executive compensation. This is the hot topic right now in the for-profit sector, and we always can look to that as guidance on what's applicable here in the nonprofit sector. And I would say that you want to make sure that you're paying reasonable compensation. People are allowed to make money and good money in the nonprofit sector, but you want to make sure that it's consistent with that purpose that you articulate in your articles and in your tax filing, and that you're staying true to that notion that you're not inappropriately benefiting a private individual. And you should consider whether there is, you need a personnel or a compensation committee if you have employees, or you're paying substantial compensation to your executive director, and whether it makes sense to potentially bring in outside consultants or others to advise you on it. So with that being said, those are my hot topics, and that is my full presentation that I have prepared on good corporate governance of nonprofits. And so we have a few minutes where I'd like to open the floor to any questions I have people here with us here or online.
You mentioned 4 committees that are often seen in nonprofits. Could you repeat these committees?
Sure. The first one is an executive committee, and that is essentially a committee that can act in the absence of the board, that essentially has the authority of the board. A lot of times you might have a board that's widely dispersed, or you have people that are hard to get a hold of because they're important people in their communities, and so you may have a subset of the board that you want to have the authority to act. It might be the 2 most involved directors and the executive director, for example. And that's something you might want to consider in a more complicated nonprofit structure. Second is a personnel committee, which would be charged with dealing with anything related to employees, staff, or compensation issues. The third is an audit committee, which would be charged with dealing with the financial, anything having to do with the finances of the organization and the engagement of an auditor. And then the final committee was the corporate governance committee, which really is charged with thinking about this topic that we've been talking about today, thinking about whether education is appropriate for directors, and thinking about where there may be, it can also function as a nominating committee to identify who may be a good director. I think I talked probably too fast where you missed everything, so if there's any other questions about anything you have, then let me know. Anyone here?
Have you run into situations where you've got directors who sit on boards, 2 different boards of organizations that serve similar missions, and there may be conflict within that scenario, sitting on the 2 boards?
Sure, I mean that's a classic conflict of interest. So let's say that you have an organization that benefits children that don't have access to health care, for example, and you have a board member that's the CEO of one hospital here in town, and then you have a board member that's the CEO of another hospital in town. They're great people to be on the board, because who else would know about children's health care than those 2 CEOs? But your organization is growing, it's getting sizable, and you're going to establish some sort of program where you're going to have you're going to have donations coming in, and you're going to be paying for health care for children, and you're picking a hospital that's going to get all these people that are referred from your organization. That would be a conflict of interest, and you would have hospital A would have an interest if this. I mean, let's imagine this is truly sizable. They would have an interest in driving those people that are be paying customers through the charitable funds of this organization to their hospital, or hospital B, where they would want to divert them there. And That's the kind of thing that you want to deal with, and then probably the best way to deal with it is to say, let's bring this up, let's recognize that this is a conflict for these directors, let's ask them to go outside the room, let's talk about it, let's figure out which contract benefits the organization because it's cheaper, because they're easier to deal with, we think they can perform a wider array of services or what have you, and then let's make the decision based on that, not based on these directors. And if you do that, if you have a policy, if you document it, and you deliberate it, you're gonna have complied with your duty of loyalty, and you're gonna have the protection of the business judgment rule.
This isn't a question, but maybe they want you to elaborate. They said you talked about recruiting board members and what to look for or to see if a person recruited will fit board.
Well, a board has, first of all, you have to have a board member that has an interest in your organization. I personally have been thinking, I really want to get involved in something else in the community, and I've been thinking, what is it that I really care about that I can really get involved with? And that's what you're looking for in a director, is you want them not to just be filling out their resume or their bio or their, potentially, trying to get on a board because a nonprofit board because they see some personal benefit. Which let's don't say that that's totally inappropriate. As long as those people have the benefit of the organization as their primary focus, there's nothing wrong with some incidental benefits as long as you discharge these fiduciary obligations. But that's really the first thing, is you want to make sure that somebody is committed to the purpose and believes in it and will stay focused for potentially years to come. Because continuity, I think, is a plus. The second thing is you've got to have somebody that's committed, that both has the time and is willing to spend the time. Some of the best directors are the people that have big jobs out in the for-profit community or government jobs, but unfortunately those people don't have the time commitment, and so it might be better to look to those people's staff and get somebody that's involved with those people, but maybe has the time that they can devote to it. And then sometimes, let's face it, some people, they may have the time, but you get them in there and they start missing meetings, and it's always something, and they just are not willing to commit to the time to it. They may have a growing family, for example, and they have small children at home, or they have other organizations they're committed to, or Little League Baseball, or whatever it may be. And so you need to just sort of make sure that you have people that are not only committed, but also have the time and willing to commit the time. And then I think the third thing is you want to make sure that that these people have something to bring to the table and are truly beneficial. There may be people that have a position in the community that makes it look like they would be a good person for the board, but maybe they don't have a lot to offer, and they're a little bit they're not really all they're cracked up to be when it comes to helping your organization advance. And so I think that those are three things I would look for if I was trying to fill out a board for my nonprofit organization.
What's the average number of people that should constitute a board?
It's funny, when I was preparing for this, I was reading, I always say you should never have one, but I was reading something and it pointed out to me that maybe in a church like in the Archdiocese of Atlanta, I think the bishop of the Archdiocese might be the sole member. And so there might be an organization where, the Pope or whoever is the sole board member. Generally, I think you want to have more than one. The Internal Revenue Code, I always advise nonprofits, you should at least have 3. If you have too few directors, it starts to look and feel like that this organization is benefiting just those 1 or 2 people. I think that in reality, you probably need to fill out your board, with 5 or more directors. You don't want to have too many. If you get too many, those people are not functioning as directors. They're really functioning as advisors, and you should have a separate entity that you create for those people that you want to have involved because they have a lot to add, or they potentially are donors that you want to feel like they're a part of the organization, but they're not willing to commit the time and effort to be board members. So you just got to find that sweet spot for your organization. But more than one usually, unless it's one of those weird situations. I think 3 at a minimum in most situations is what I would say. Certainly 3 if you're just forming, getting it off the ground. And then you want to flesh it out to get a group of people that meet all those obligations. I would say another thing is we all need money in our nonprofits. And so obviously a great way to get money is to get somebody on board. But make sure they meet those other things, because we can always come up with a name for those people and make them feel like they're part of the organization, but not give them the responsibility and the accountability of being a board member.
What do you do when you have people on the board that may or may not have the time they said they did initially?
Fire. No, you gotta have a mechanism. Board members are generally elected by a majority of the other board members, and in a lot of nonprofits, you can let people slide through a year. That's why it's good, I think, to have an annual election, so that annually you re-elect people, and it's a lot easier to not re-elect someone than to vote them off the board. But the other way that you deal with that really is you have an attendance policy and you adhere to it. You don't have waivers of that. If you have a waiver of it, it's a big deal. And by doing that, you can say, gee whiz, we love having you on the board. You've been great when you've been here, but you've only been to 3 of the 10 meetings this year, and so our policy is strict and we have to have you off the board. But we would like for you to serve as a advisor emeritus or some other title we can make up for that person, so that they can continue to be a part of the organization. So I think those are the best ways. You want to hardwire an attendance policy in, and you want to maybe even hardwire an annual election. I'll tell you, in the for-profit sector, we deal with this a lot with age. People just want to die on the board, and so you have to come up with an age policy. And you can have a waiver. I mean, if somebody's still adding value and still coming to meetings, even if they're getting on up in age. But that's a great way to let a director go out in style, where you basically say, look, you've done a great job, but you've aged out under our age policy. So hardwiring some of that stuff in place is the best way to deal with it.
What about confidentiality? Should there be a policy that will protect the organization from board members raising information from the organization and using it for their own personal benefit?
I think that there should be an understanding that you have a duty built up. I think I put it in the duty of loyalty. Built up within your fiduciary duties is a duty to maintain the confidence of the organization. You don't have to write that in a contract. That's a basic duty. I mean, it's just like your duty to, read stuff and go to and to not engage in self-dealing. Those are fiduciary duties. They're grafted on you by law. You don't need a contract to put that legal obligation on somebody. They come with the job. And so that confidential obligation is on the directors. You don't need them to sign something or to agree to something. But if somebody discloses things, or if they do anything else that is in breach of any contractual or legal obligation that's put upon them by their fiduciary duties or otherwise, they should be removed from the board by the directors without variation. That's how you deal with that.
Where can one find a template for a code of ethics policy and whistleblower policy?
I think that Pro Bono Partnership has a template for the conflict of interest policy and the code of ethics policy, and I believe there's other organizations out there that have those. The website is pbpatl.org. So that's pbpatl.org. I found this morning when I was looking at some stuff that there is another Pro Bono Partnership website. So you got to be sure you go to pbpatl.org because there's other Pro Bono partnerships, I suppose.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you were talking about the board terms and the importance of, it's kind of like keeping your board list clean, why is that so important? Because I've seen boards where they think, oh, well, we'll just have 30 members, and when we need fundraising, we can call this person, and if they don't come, it's not a big deal. Why is that so important that you have really active members on the board?
Because they have to discharge their fiduciary duties. Everything the directors do, every action they take has to be informed, in good faith, with the care that an ordinary prudent person would exercise in in similar situations or whatever I said. Not engage in self-dealing, act in the best interest of the organization. To do those things, you just can't do it with 30 people. And there's a place for those people. You want to have a board of trustees. You want to have the the circle of gold, or the love circle, or something. I mean, you got to make up some group that you put these people in, where they are benefactors to your organization. They feel a part of it, and they have a say in an audience. You know, they have the board members as their audience when they have something to add of value. But you literally can't function with 30 board members. I don't think. Some people do it. I wouldn't. I would never advise somebody to do it. I think it'd be very hard pressed to find a business corporation that potentially generates billions of dollars of revenue that has 30 directors. Did you have something, Rob?
Is quorum an issue there?
Quorum would be an issue. It's, if you got to have, if the majority has to be there, and you got to find, you got to have a quorum there, it might be difficult to get all those people. Arguably, it should be a fixed problem depending on how many directors you have. But yeah, I mean, if you got to have 15 people there, it's a lot of people. Is that it? All right, well, thank you for having me. I hope this was helpful, and I'm available. I've got my address there, but no email address. But you can certainly find me on the internet at Kilpatrick Stockton's webpage or through Pro Bono Partnership, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has later on. So thank you.